Yes, I'm a plant taxonomist, so an example of one of Rob's rare disciplines. This is a great opportunity for me to try and spread the word about what the plant taxonomic community in the world is doing to try and contribute towards some of these grand challenges. And one of the projects which I'm going to be talking about is the bid to come together to bring existing taxonomic and systematic data together and also generate new data to try and give background information, fundamental information on plants, the names and their distributions, so this information can get used by taxonomists and systematists around the world, but also to contribute towards the knowledge which goes into climate change studies and also looking at providing information and support to policymakers who are faced with conservation and other challenges such as sustainable use. I think I'm preaching to the converted here when I say that all life on Earth ultimately depends on the plant species we have on Earth. And we estimate that there are about 400,000 plant species. That's bryophyte mosses and above. I'm not talking about algae and the fungi. That figure would be way bigger if I was. A sobering estimate is we think that there are about 100,000 of those species which are threatened through extinction. That's an awful lot of species which might potentially have the solutions to some of the problems and in climate change mitigation or crop breeding and so forth, which is going to make our planet survive into the future. So I think it's important that it's clearly important that there is a strive for conservation and sustainable use policies and practices which need to be implemented in the near future. Quite a lot of you work on model organisms or crop plants and maybe don't appreciate that when you look at plants on a global scale, those 400,000 species, we have a very incomplete knowledge about all of those species. There's currently no comprehensive documentation, scientific overview of all those species. And some of the most basic information which is needed to identify conservation priority species is missing. We don't have a globally accepted list of plant names, which is needed for communication on national or global levels. We don't have the identification tools to apply those names, and we certainly don't have complete knowledge of geographic distribution and occurrence, which are the rare species, which of them are in decline. And that's just the information you need to establish IUCN conservation assessments to prioritise which species are okay and which species need to be looked at on a conservation basis. Once you've identified which species are under threat, you need much more information. You need information on the genetics, the population dynamics, how the plants are used, trade sources, harvesting regimes, and so forth. But just focusing on the most important plants, the most fundamental information, we are still far from complete. If we look at the UK, which has a remarkably well-known flora. This here is a book called A Flora, which is a compendium of all the plants, information on all the plants found in the British Isles. So we've got accurate names, distributions, descriptions, and so forth. It's an encyclopedia of knowledge of the plants in the British Isles. We've had this for many decades already, and it's a highly refined work. We not only have the technical guide, we have many different photographic guides to help people identify plants. And we've even got a guide which doesn't rely on using flowers or fruits. We can identify things straight in the vegetative state. We also have an awful lot of information about plant distributions. People have been recording plants where they occur for many decades, and this information has been collated together in the National Biodiversity Network, so we can either plot distributions on the countrywide scale or even go down to much finer scales and look at local occurrences. And this occurrences these distributional assessments have been done over a period of time, so we have time slices. We can look at which species are increasing and which species are decreasing. So we have a very good idea of which plants are in need of conservation attention in the UK. Coupled to that, we have a lot more information which takes us to the advanced stages where we can start doing something about it. We can input into biodiversity action plans. So we have things on the biological relationships with other organisms, the ecological information, and also on the genetics as well. There's lots and lots of published work which has been brought together by websites. So there's lots of information at the fingertips of scientists, environmentalists, and conservationists in the UK. If we look on the world scale, the situation is very, very different. The northern hemisphere has got much denser pink areas. The dense pink is where there's a lot more recent knowledge. But many areas of the world have got very paler colours where there's no comprehensive flora, or maybe not even a checklist, a bare list of names of species which are thought to occur in those countries. And it's against that background of incomplete knowledge, which is hampering conservation, that the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation was born in 2002 as a programme under the Convention on Biological Diversity. The GSPC established 5 main objectives, the top one being plant diversity is well understood, documented and recognised. I won't go through the other parts because it's that first objective which I'm focusing on in this talk. Under those objectives there were 16 targets, and the first and most important of those targets was to produce a working list of known plant species by the year 2010, the first national year, the International Year of Biodiversity. In order to achieve that target, Missouri Botanic Garden and Kew Botanic Garden here in the UK got together and pooled their data sets and other data sets that they were able to bring into the project, and they produced, through a whole series of complicated algorithms, the first working list of all plant species on Earth. Sorry, the first plant species list for over 100 years. It hadn't been done. We hadn't had a list which would give us an idea of how many species and what those names were. This included over 1 million names of plants, and about 300,000 of those were accepted names. You could type in the name of a species and you would get to which was the accepted name, which were the synonyms. This was a great leap forward, but I said at the start we still don't have a complete list of plant names, and that's true because there were nearly 250,000 unresolved names, and from the ratio of synonyms to accepted names we think there's about another 100,000 names which will be accepted once those names are resolved, hence the 400,000 species total which I talked about earlier. So a lot more taxonomic work, taxonomic research needs to go in to make this list much more complete. There were also problems in the algorithms they used to merge the data. It was done in rather a hurry, and there was a lot of unreliable data in there. So that's been addressed over the last couple of years, and version 2 of the plant list is going to be released in the next couple of months, which will have a lot more reliable data. As the timeline was running out for the 2010, the 2010 targets, the GSPC targets were looked at again, upgraded and revised. So the bar was set a lot higher for the next 10 years. And this was adopted by the convention of the CBD meeting in Nagoya in 2010, which took all those 16 targets and extended them. And instead of just trying to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss, they set the very ambitious overall aim of trying to halt biodiversity loss by 2020. The first of those targets was upgraded from just a working list to an online flora of all known plants. And that means taking that list and adding to it other data which is going to provide that basic core set of data required to do conservation assessments. So descriptive information, identification tools, and distributional information. This plea for the World Online Flora, Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, Royal Botanic Gardens Kew teamed up with Missouri Botanic Garden and New York Botanic Garden to see how this could be addressed. And this team got together about just over a year ago in Missouri and laid the foundations for the World Online Flora, produced a technical report saying how this could be done. This technical report was endorsed by the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation and the International Botanical Congress in Melbourne in 2001. And then subsequently, the CBD adopted it as part of its official working practices, both at the Science and Technical Advisory Body in Montreal in May last year and at Hyderabad at the Convention of the Parties in October last year. And all of those international organisations stress the need that this world, the widely accessible flora of all known plants is a fundamental requirement of conservation, and also provides a baseline for achievement of all the other targets in the CBD. But what might the World Flora Online be? As some people were talking about yesterday, the internet is the font of all knowledge, so I keyed in World Flora last year on Google Images, and this is the series of images that popped up as the top hits. As a botanist, it's pretty frustrating that plants don't feature very highly in that, although I guess having some bryophytes as a backdrop to these rather embarrassed frogs is actually a little bit of a step in the right direction. I did it again last week when I was putting this talk together, and I was pleased to see that plants actually feature a lot more heavily in the top Google hits for World Flora, the images. It's all interesting that our meeting in Missouri also popped up quite highly in that as part of the World Flora. But it was also slightly disturbing to see something like this, which I thought was sort of a trailer for one of the new Doctor Who episodes. So it's probably easier to say what the World Flora Online isn't. It's not intended to be a comprehensive species-by-species monograph of every plant in the world. That just simply would take too long and wouldn't be practicable for the time that we have available. This is the approach which the Species Plantarum project is taking, and they're doing a great job at working their way through and providing incredible data, but we're just not going to get anywhere near comprehensive treatment if we adopt that process. So we're intending to be a website which brings together all the available data that we have, but also then links out to the more detailed and more rich data in other data sets. It's certainly going to be global in scope and will include everything from mosses and liverworts upwards. So just as a schematic, and this is I think the only diagram I've got in the talk, data provided by national and regional floras and monographs is going to feed core data so that it can be searched and accessed within the World Flora Online database. The plant list will provide a names backbone which will sit alongside the names provided from the other data sources to allow queries and queries to be undertaken. And then users will then be able to go back to the original sources to find out more detailed, more enriched information, but also be able to go find onward links to get into other information such as observation data in the Global Biodiversity Environment Facility, literature in the Biodiversity Heritage Library, and so forth. Looking at the core fields which we're looking to store within the World Flora Online, I'm not going to go through these in any detail. You can look at them as they're up there. But the main areas are classification, so an accepted list of plant names, species, but also represented alternative classifications because we recognise that regional contributions will have their own classifications which need to be brought in and included within it. There'll be as much identification tools as we can provide through descriptions, images, and keys. But a very key point will be having distributional information at country level, which will allow people to type in taxonomic names or find out which species occur in particular countries. And the other main key area of this is that these data will be fully accredited and referenced back to the original source, so attribution of the data providers is going to be extremely important. So I said, writing this kind of information resource from scratch is certainly not practical. We've got very little time, and so we need to take a practical and pragmatic approach. Much of the data we estimate is already existing in digital format or in printed format, so we want to draw on all that information. But the task of trying to do that is really, really complicated. But for the first time, we think it's actually achievable. But for those people who think this is purely an informatics project, this is far from the case. Plant taxonomists are not going to get done out of a job out of this. We are going to be needed to help resolve some of the taxonomies, the different classifications which are being used. And we also needed to generate new floristic and monographic work in order to plug some information gaps and also update some of the very old information which is currently available for some regions. Just to give you a couple of examples of some of the data which is already available and out there. Digital floras are available for a growing number of countries. Just to highlight the flora of Australia, flora Mesoamericana taking a regional approach. But there are also monographic projects out there, and we've heard already in this talk about the Solanaceae work that Sandy Knapp's been doing, but there's also other big initiatives such as the eMonocot project at Kew Oxford Natural History Museum and involving people elsewhere. Species Plantarum project is taking a monographic approach, as I said earlier, and beginning to work its way through. And at Edinburgh we have several of these, of which the ferns of Thailand I'm using as an example. So we estimate that probably about 50% of all the species in the world can be covered by these electronic resources to greater or lesser extent. So a large chunk will be relatively easy to pull together. Less easy to access will be the non-digital data, things which are only in printed form. Now quite a lot of that is, if you like, made digital because it's made as a PDF and made available online through the Internet Archive and so forth. But actually, in order to be useful within the system, you're going to have to abstract out some of the data, so the information on plant names and country distributions, in order for us to include those in the searches and then allow people to go and view those original PDFs. So there'll be quite a lot of marking up of PDF texts. Again, not too difficult, but achievable in the short time frame. What's more difficult is trying to address some of the real knowledge gaps which are known to exist. Returning to this big map here, these areas which are in pale, this is Brazil here, and Toby Pennington showed the picture of Flora brasiliensis, but that's like 1880. It's pretty much out of date. The Brazilians are working hard on updating checklists and other information, but they still don't have a new updated comprehensive flora. My own work in the Himalayan region is at the moment focused on addressing that knowledge gap in Nepal, and I'll return to that a little bit later. This map was produced in 2010, and in 2011 we produced our first volume of the flora of Nepal, so it will get a little bit more pink now and as the time progresses. Two approaches to addressing these knowledge gaps. One is to look at floristic treatments of individual countries, so looking at those pale areas and trying to get floristic projects initiated in those areas, such as the flora of Nepal, as I mentioned. But you can also take a monographic approach, looking at all of the plants within a particular plant family across the whole world. And some recent work at Kew has identified some major plant families which have not been monographed in recent times. And if you just took those, you'll cover an awful lot numbers of species. So I think a two-pronged attack of stimulating floristic work plus also monographic revisions is needed in order to plug some of these gaps. But it's going to be difficult because it's going to require substantial funding. And I'll return to that a bit later. I'd like to stress that the UK is playing a major part in this global initiative. As I mentioned earlier, the UK is probably one of the earliest countries to have a complete flora and comprehensive knowledge of its own plants. But it's also been involved through colonial exploration and other worldwide exploration in the exploration of plants and discovery of plants in many countries around the world. This has resulted in that we have a lot of historic material on which to base the descriptions on, but also we've got expertise and in research and collaboration in countries all around the world, so we're helping other people around the world write their own floras. Looking today, we're working in partnership with many countries and also international consortia, such as the monocots and so forth, to provide this baseline floristic data. And we're also coupling that with in-country capacity building activities to try and help people in country get trained up in this work and carry it on from themselves. A lot of this capacity work has been funded in recent years through the UK Darwin Initiative. I mentioned earlier that Edinburgh, Kew and Missouri and New York Botanic Garden have taken the lead in establishing the World Online Flora as a project. This has now moved on and there are more partners involved. Up to 30 organisations around the world are now involved is a pledging part of the consortium for the World Flora Online. We'll also be major data providers along with the Natural History Museum, and also providing into the technical aspects of the project, because we've got a lot of expertise in the biodiversity informatics which is needed to try and bring all this information together. Just briefly looking at one of the projects that I've been involved with, the Flora of Nepal. Nowadays, the printed work is not considered to be the ultimate output of the project. Nowadays, the floristic knowledge base is the output of the project. All the information on plant nomenclature, classification, distribution, descriptions and so forth is included in the knowledge base along with the illustrations and images. And this is then used to produce outputs such as the printed flora, but also online resources and data downloads such as these species level occurrences in Nepal, which then go into other studies such as environmental modelling. Of course, there's still a need for producing the printed version, but there's also, we're making this available as PDF downloads online, where people can get the most up-to-date treatments available and the treatments in advance of publishing the main floras. Occurrence data itself is made freely available. Every plant that we collect on expeditions, the data is made available along with the images which are taken. This, along with the herbarium specimens, provides a huge data source of occurrence records which feed into these modelling studies. Capacity building, as I mentioned, is a very important part of what we do, and it's one of the opportunities with the World Flora Online. We realise that in some of these countries which are poorly understood have poor capacities in which to provide the data and contribute to the flora. So we think the World Flora Online will give them the mechanism in which to try and attract extra funding from things such as the Global Environment Facility and international aid groups like the UK Aid. But we also realise that these countries need to have good access to the online facilities in order for them to fully make use of the World Online Flora. Just the last couple of slides now, where we are. This is a project which is just starting. It's only started over a year ago now, and these big international projects take a long time to gather momentum. We've got a consortium now of about 30 international botanical institutes spread literally throughout the world, and they've approved the consortium memorandum of understanding and are busily signing up their institutes so they're formally linked with the process. I mentioned that the project's been formally approved by the Convention on Biological Diversity's Convention of the Parties meeting in Hyderabad, and the inner workings of the project have started with the setting up of two working groups, one looking at the technical aspects of the project, what use cases need to be supported by the users of the data, and how we can embed that functionality into the online portal. The taxonomic working group has only really just started looking at the taxonomic gaps, the flora gap, the gaps in floristic knowledge, and then deciding how to address those and trying to engage individual groups around the world in order to try and plug those gaps. The next meeting of the consortium is going to be here in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in November 2013. And at that's when a lot of these technical groups will be reporting and contributing to trying to fulfil this target within the next 6 years, which is a major ask. So as far as opportunity is concerned, as a taxonomic community, this is a great opportunity for us to really make some impact of the work that we've been doing for literally a couple of centuries now. We are able to contribute our digital data into a global resource which is going to increase our impact and put this information at the fingertips of policymakers and other scientists. It's going to give us the opportunity to mobilize a lot of non-digital data. We've mobilized it sort of by creating PDFs, but this will allow us to mark it up and really incorporate it into this wider data stream. I mentioned the gap filling. This is going to be important for countries such as Nepal to be able to leverage funding from organizations such as the Global Environment Facility in order to try and get some funding in to help them fill their gaps. And you mentioned earlier Myanmar, that's definitely a knowledge gap. It's a big white hole in that part of Asia. But for users, once the World Flora Online is up and running, this will provide for the first time a global overview of all the diversities of plants that we have on this planet. For individual countries which don't have individual floras, by 2020 we're not expecting to achieve that gold-plated standard of having data available for the whole world. We're going to reach a bar which is going to have to be extended. And there'll be countries in there which won't be able to achieve having a completed flora in time. Certainly Nepal will be one of those, will still be incomplete. But the data which is drawn together will help kickstart their research, because they'll be able to draw on floristic data from surrounding countries in order to help plug their own gaps. And lastly, we believe that it will become an essential tool for conservation planners and policymakers, and hopefully practitioners of all levels. And people like yourselves will be using it to draw on data to find out about crop relatives and other plants on a global scale. It is in early days yet. Hopefully you'll be hearing more about this as the years carry on. We do have a website, although at the moment it's really, really primitive and it's just really an internal thing to develop some prototypes on. So please watch this space, and thank you very much for listening.